She was just the janitor until one rainy night. She solved an equation that had baffled the world's top engineers for weeks. No degree, no permission, just brilliance hidden behind a mop. What happened next shattered every rule of hierarchy and forced a cold billionaire CEO to confront everything he thought he knew about power, genius, and love. But when the world mocked her, he stayed silent, and that silence nearly destroyed everything. This isn't just a story of redemption. It's a rebellion in disguise. Are you ready to meet the woman who changed everything by being seen? Elena Torres wasn't supposed to notice the equation. Her job was to wipe fingerprints off glass, not decipher the tangled thoughts of engineers paid more in a month than she had made in the last year. And yet, on that rainy Thursday night, when most of the NeuroCore building had gone silent and the last elevator dinged its way down to the parking garage, she stood alone in the executive think tank room facing the remnants of a battle. She hadn't fought but somehow understood. The whiteboard was cluttered with fragments of thought calculations, loops, and logic branches sketched in increasingly frustrated handwriting. Someone had gone through several colors of dry erase markers and just as many rounds of hope. Equations had been crossed out, rewritten, circled, and finally abandoned. A few half-eaten protein bars and cold espresso shots still lingered on the side table like artifacts from a failed expedition. Elena's mop bucket squeaked faintly as she paused, examining the board, not as a janitor, but as someone who used to love problems before life made her put them away. She pulled a cloth from her apron and reached for the lower edge of the board, intending to do what she always did: erase and reset the world for the next group of thinkers. But her hand hesitated as her eyes caught the pattern. Not the numbers themselves, but the way they stumbled, repeated, folded in on themselves. It wasn't the first time she had seen broken logic masquerading as brilliance. A memory surfaced, one she had buried under years of wiping away other people's ideas. Her sophomore year in college, before she'd had to drop out to care for her father, she had written a paper about recursive loops in poetry, how form could mimic function, how language could reveal what equations concealed. She remembered comparing T.S. Eliot to symbolic logic. Her professor had called her mad and brilliant. Elena reached for a red marker, just a small substitution, a veritable reassigned. Then a diagonal loop to her hand moved quickly, with purpose, without apology. The silence in the room deepened, as if the building itself was holding its breath. In less than a minute, the chaos on the board had transformed into something else, something clean, functional, and dare she think it beautiful. She stepped back, capped the marker, and smiled to herself. Even code needs rhythm, she whispered, then added with a grin and a little dignity. She was turning to leave when a sound stopped her. The soft click of expensive shoes on polished floor. She froze. Standing at the doorway was Graham Whitaker. Elena had seen him before. Of course, on posters, in company videos, in the elevator once when she ducked her head and pretended to scrub her phone screen. He was the kind of man who made silence heavier when he entered a room. Tall, sharply built, with the kind of posture that made you want to apologize for your own. His suit was impeccably cut in a shade of gray that probably had a name like Mercury, dusk, but it was his eyes, ceasy and calculated, that made her forget how to breathe for a moment. He was looking at the board, then at her, then back at the board. "Was that you?" he asked, his voice calm but not casual. She blinked. "If you mean the board, then yes." He walked in slowly, almost mechanically, his eyes narrowing at the math. "This loop, it's clean. That substitution, none of our consultants thought of it. They probably thought too hard," Elena replied before she could stop herself. He turned sharply, not angry, just surprised. That equation was part of a cognitive reinforcement model. "We've had 10 engineers on it for 3 weeks. She shrugged. "Sometimes, when you stand too close, you can't see the shape of the thing." He stared at her again. This time not like she didn't belong, but as if he was trying to fit her into a system that hadn't accounted for her. "What's your name?" "Elena Torres." He considered it, then nodded. "I want you in the morning briefing. 9 a.m. conference room E." She raised a brow. "You want the janitor in your technical briefing?" "No," he said. "I want the only person who saw what 20 experts missed." Then he turned and walked out without another word. Elena stood frozen for several long seconds, staring at the space where he had been. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She looked back at the board, at the elegant flow of her revision. Then she turned off the lights and whispered to no one, What the hell just happened? The next morning, Alina woke earlier than usual. She ironed her janitor's uniform twice. Though she told herself it was only to remove wrinkles, she pulled her hair into a neater bun than she typically bothered with, and packed a small notebook in her tote bag, the one with poetry quotes, written in fading ink on the inside flap. The executive floor felt different in the morning light, sharper, colder, more aware of itself. People moved with the precision of machines calibrated for ambition. When she entered the conference room, a dozen heads turned toward her. She felt each gaze like a challenge, or worse, like a test she hadn't been told she was taking. Graham stood at the head of the table. He didn't introduce her immediately. He waited until the room had quieted, until all attention was on him. "This is Alina Torres," he said evenly. "Last night, she solved the recursive pattern in our intuition loop that the core team had been stuck on. She'll be joining us as an observer." An awkward silence followed. Some raised eyebrows, a cough, a whispered, "Seriously?" But Graham's tone brokered no discussion. Alina took the last seat at the end of the table. She listened, carefully. The discussion was fast, technical, and occasionally arrogant, but underneath it, she sensed the same structure she'd seen on the board. Brilliant people overcomplicating what begged for elegance. Halfway through the session, one of the junior engineers stumbled through a model explanation, something about adaptive emotional layering in synthetic agents. Everyone waited for Graham to correct him, but instead, Alina raised her hand. "I think what you're trying to say," she began, cautiously, "is that the AI is reacting, not understanding, like someone repeating lines in a play without knowing what the scene is about." There was a pause, then a murmur. "That's exactly it," the engineer said. Graham nodded, silently. Later, another executive tried to frame AI bias correction through statistical regression. Alina quietly offered a metaphor involving a cracked mirror and distorted reflections. Even the skeptics leaned in. After the meeting, as everyone filed out, Graham lingered behind. "You think in patterns," he said, almost as a question. "I think in poetry," she replied. "Patterns are just poetry with numbers." He smiled, a small one, the first real one she had ever seen from him. "You should think about doing this more often." She looked at him, then at the whiteboard behind him, the same board she had once wiped clean without reading. "I think I already am." That night, Alina didn't return to the janitor's closet on the second floor right away. She went to the rooftop garden, a rarely used space where interns sometimes ate lunch and executives occasionally hosted catered networking events. It was quiet now. The city lights stretched out like a map of possibilities. She sat on the bench, beside the potted succulents, and took out her notebook. She wrote a single line: "Even brilliance needs permission to be seen." Then she flipped the page and began sketching a new kind of equation, one with variables shaped like doors, one that opened when you stopped pretending you weren't meant to be in the room. Somewhere below, lights flickered on in a corner office. Graham was still working, or maybe thinking. So was she, and for the first time in years, Alina didn't feel invisible. She felt inevitable. Alina Torres didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even excitement. It was something deeper, more electric-like, standing too close to a power line humming with energy. The memory of the morning meeting stayed with her long after she had changed back into her janitor's uniform, after she had mopped the hallway outside the boardroom, after she'd pressed her palm to the cool elevator panel and watched the floor numbers light up. She didn't know what had shifted exactly, but she felt it. Something had turned inside her like a gear that had long been rusted in place, suddenly catching hold again. When she arrived at Nuracore the next morning, she wore the same uniform, but carried herself a little differently. It wasn't that. She walked with pride. Alina had always been careful with that kind of thing. It was more a quiet steadiness in her shoulders, as if her spine remembered its strength. Word had already spread. The whiteboard whisper, the janitor incident. Some referred to her with sarcasm, others with curiosity, but no one ignored her anymore. Graham Whitaker, true to his nature, said nothing to anyone about it, not even when a VP asked him, half-jokingly, "Are we recruiting from the janitorial pool now?" He simply looked at the man with that narrow-eyed calculating stare and replied, "We recruit from wherever brilliance lives." And that was the end of that conversation. At 10 a.m., Alina found herself sitting in a smaller conference room with 5 engineers, 2 directors, and a neurolinguistic consultant from MIT, who kept adjusting his glasses like the frames were the only things holding him together. She wasn't introduced with fanfare. She wasn't introduced at all. Graham had simply gestured toward the seat beside him as she entered, and she took it. The room, so stark in its hierarchy just days ago, now regarded her with an odd mixture of tension and attention. She wasn't sure which one made her more nervous. The discussion began with a data model and intricate GRA-PH mapping predictive behavior responses in AI systems designed to simulate empathy. The consultant from MIT launched into an explanation, his voice dry, his words bloated with jargon. Alina listened carefully, eyes tracking the projected display. But something about the language grated on her. It was so detached, so clinical. They were talking about emotional intelligence, as if it were a software patch. When he paused for input, no one spoke. So she did. "I think you're approaching this like a logic puzzle," she said, gently but clearly. "But empathy doesn't begin with algorithms, it begins with stories. Maybe you should be asking how the AI perceives context, not just input." The consultant frowned. "We're asking that it's embedded in the node selection process." "But are you testing for narrative coherence?" she asked. "Or just linear response?" There was a pause. "You're suggesting," Arthur, the technical director, leaned in, "that we build in narrative sequencing, a memory path, not just a reaction model." She nodded. "We don't learn how to care from data. We learn it from remembering moments, patterns, a bedtime story, the look on someone's face when we hurt them. If your system can't remember how its actions were received, it can't grow emotional nuance. It can only mimic." Silence filled the room. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that happens when people realize the conversation just shifted to a new dimension. Graham spoke next, his voice quiet, measured. "Alina, I'd like you to map out what that might look like. On paper. Just some ideas." She hesitated. "You mean like ... formally?" "I mean like yourself. However your brain wants to do it." She didn't realize until later how much that sentence meant. Not how the company wants you to do it. Not how engineers present findings. Just, however you think. For the next 3 hours, she sat with them questioning, sketching, flipping through a notebook she had carried for years and never dared to use in this building. And no one stopped her. At one point, she even cracked a joke. Something about recursive empathy loops being like dating the same kind of person over and over and expecting a different outcome. The room laughed. Not politely, actually laughed. Later that week, when they met again to test a new segment of the emotional model, Arthur asked, "Where's Elena?" Before they even booted up the demo, she walked in 2 minutes later, balancing a tray of coffees she'd brought for everyone. "Neurofuel," she said, placing the cups down. "And before anyone complains, I asked the AI what flavor you'd like." Another round of laughter. But this time, it felt like home. By Friday, people were coming to her desk, her janitorial closet, for feedback. Not formal consultations, not official reviews, just passing comments like, "Hey, you have a minute?" Or "Can I run something by you real quick?" Even Rachel, the project's lead UX designer, approached her during a fire drill. They were both huddled near the stairs, watching people file out. "I don't know how you do it," Rachel said. "You explain things like they're poetry." Elena shrugged. "I think in rhythm. It's how I understand the world." Rachel smiled. "Maybe we should all learn to listen to the music." Elena looked down at her shoes. Same worn sneakers, same uniform, same ID badge clipped to her hip. And yet, something about how people looked at her had changed. Or maybe, something in how she saw herself. That night, after the building emptied out, she wandered into the think tank again. Not to clean, just to be there. The lights were low. The whiteboard still held scribbles from that morning's brainstorm. She stood quietly for a moment, then reached for a marker. Not to erase, not this time. She wrote a line at the bottom of the board, in green ink. "Empathy is not simulated, it is remembered." Then she stepped back, admiring not the elegance of the sentence, but the feeling of being allowed to leave her thoughts behind. Not just footprints. She didn't hear him come in, but she felt it, the stillness of his presence. Graham stood behind her, holding a coffee cup, watching her silently. "Good line," he said. She turned. "It's how I see it." He nodded, then stepped forward, looking at the board. "You do something the rest of us can't," he said quietly. "You translate ideas into meaning." She tilted her head. "Isn't that what language is for?" "Language is for expression," he replied. "Meaning is for understanding." She smiled. Then maybe we're both translators. You just use numbers. I use stories. He looked at her a moment too long, then offered her the second coffee he held. Peace offering, he said. I didn't know we were at war. He chuckled. Neither did I. But you're winning. They stood in silence for a moment, sipping coffee in the glow of the room they'd both come to know differently, he from the top down, she from the ground up. When Alina finally left that night, she felt a quiet resolve blooming in her chest. Not the kind of confidence that announces itself, the kind that waits, steady and sure, for the moment it's needed. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She belonged, and for the first time in her life, she knew it. Alina Torres had always found elevators comforting. Maybe it was the symmetry, the defined space between floors, the silence that allowed her thoughts to echo. Or maybe it was the way elevators forced stillness, brief pauses between destinations, where nothing could be done but wait. She liked that. Life rarely offered such deliberate in-betweens, until the day the elevator didn't move. It was late. Later than usual, and she had stayed behind to finalize notes for a presentation Graham asked her to help prepare. Something about integrating emotional mapping into their new AI models' decision trees. It had been her idea, in theory, and she had stumbled into a language that made it comprehensible, even to their most numbers-obsessed engineers. Graham didn't say much after her presentation draft. He just nodded and added, "You speak in structures, Alina. They hold." She took it as the closest thing to praise he ever gave. That night, she entered the elevator on the 18th floor, her tote bag slung over her shoulder, her mind preoccupied with unfinished thoughts and diagrams. She pressed the button for the ground floor and leaned against the mirrored wall. The elevator began its descent with a quiet hum, but when it reached the 12th floor, it shuddered. Once hand stopped. She blinked, pressed the button again. Nothing. A small flicker of panic ran down her spine. She pressed the emergency call button, and a soothing voice came on, assuring her that technicians had been dispatched. "Minor electrical disruption," they said. "Please remain calm." The clock on her phone ticked forward. Minutes passed, then more. And then, as if fate wasn't done toying with her, the elevator stopped again, this time to admit one other person. Graham Whitaker stepped in, frowning slightly as the doors opened halfway, then groaned shut again. His phone lost signal before he could make a call. "Well," he said, exhaling, "this is unfortunate." Alina gave a small, half-smile. "Guess even billionaires have to wait sometimes." He glanced at her. "I've always hated elevators." She raised a brow. "Why?" "Too small, too quiet, too many expectations in one confined space." He leaned against the opposite wall, folding his arms, "and no control. That last one's probably the real reason." He gave her a look, half annoyed, half impressed. "You're getting bolder." She shrugged. "Maybe I'm just getting used to speaking around you." They stood in silence for a few beats. The emergency lights glowed soft and amber, casting both of their reflections in the mirrored walls, double versions of themselves, each lost in thought. Graham broke the silence first. "You know, when I started Neurocore, I thought I'd feel something once it succeeded. Relief, maybe, satisfaction, but mostly, it just made me lonelier." Alina turned to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "Lonelier?" He nodded slowly. "People stop talking to you." "Not really. They talk around you, or through you, or for you, but not to you. Everyone either wants something, or fears losing something." He looked down at his shoes, then added quietly, "You were the first person in this building who spoke to me like I was a person, not a paycheck." She felt the weight of his words settle in the confined space between them. It wasn't pity she felt, but recognition, the ache of being seen too much, or not at all. She had lived both. "I think maybe loneliness doesn't come from being alone," she said softly, "but from being surrounded by people who don't see your insides." He looked up, met her gaze. "What do you see when you look at me, Alina?" The question landed heavy and unexpected. She considered her answer. "I see someone who's always calculating. Always holding things just close enough to control them, but never close enough to touch. Someone who forgets he's allowed to feel something besides pressure." A flicker of emotion passed across his face. Not offense, not defensiveness, something quieter, something like grief. "You remind me," he said slowly, "that there's still someone inside this machine I built around myself." She held his gaze, and something unspoken hung in the air, fragile, electric. Then the elevator jolted and hummed back to life. They both exhaled as the floors resumed their silent march downward. When the doors opened at the lobby, they didn't move right away. "I'll walk you out," he said. She shook her head. "I'm okay." He didn't insist. But before she turned away, he reached into his jacket and handed her a small, folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "My mother used to write me quotes when I was a kid. I started doing the same, lately, for myself. That one reminded me of you." She unfolded the paper. "Some are born with silence. Others choose it, but the brave learn to break it." She looked up. He was already walking toward the exit. She held the quote for a long time after that, standing alone in the lobby, feeling the weight of something more than words in her hand. The next morning, she entered the building earlier than usual. The security guard smiled and gave her a knowing nod. Word traveled fast. People weren't just talking about her ideas anymore. They were talking about her presence. In the elevator, she pressed the button for the 18th floor and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She wasn't sure what was changing between her and Graham, but she knew something was, and it wasn't just professional. It was personal, unspoken. Still forming its shape. By lunchtime, Rachel cornered her in the break room with a mischievous grin. "Tell me everything." Alina blinked. "About what? Please." "The elevator. It's all over slack." Alina laughed. "Nothing happened." Rachel leaned in. "Exactly, nothing happened. Which means it wasn't forced. Which means it meant something." Alina rolled her eyes but smiled. "You've got too much imagination." Rachel wagged her finger. "That's how love stories start." Alina shook her head but tucked the folded quote deeper into her notebook. She didn't want to believe in stories, but some part of her, the part that once thought in poems, was beginning to wonder. That evening, after the last department cleared out, Graham found her in the think tank again, sketching an emotional response tree in chalk on the large blackboard wall they used for visual concepting. He watched from the doorway. "May I?" She nodded. He picked up a piece of chalk and, without a word, added a line to her diagram, one she hadn't considered. But that made everything flow better. They stood, side by side, neither of them speaking, the chalk dust like snow on their hands. In that moment, there were no titles, no walls, just two people sharing the language of thought, of recognition. And in that stillness, Alina understood something profound. Sometimes the most transformative connections don't begin with touch. They begin with silence, broken, gently, together. The photo wasn't supposed to matter. It was blurry, poorly lit, snapped through the glass wall of the think tank conference room. In it, Alina stood in front of a whiteboard, one arm mid-air, drawing a curve across an emotional logic map. Her uniform navy blue, with the NeuroCore janitorial badge still clipped to her hip, was in full view. The shot had been taken by someone passing by, likely amused, likely with no real intention beyond capturing an oddity. The janitor teaching AI engineers how empathy works. But by noon the next day, it had over 50,000 views on X. By 2 o'clock, it had been turned into a meme. By 5, it was a scandal. Alina didn't see it at first. She was deep in code review with Rachel and Arthur, drafting a simulation loop based on one of her earlier models. Rachel's phone buzzed first. She went still, her jaw tightening as she scrolled. "Alina," she said softly, passing the phone. Across the table, it was the photo, and below it, a caption in bright red block letters: "NeuroCore's new tech strategy. Just mop up your problems." Another post followed: "Empathy 101, taught by your janitor." They weren't just mocking her, they were mocking the idea that someone without a degree, without status, without permission, could belong in the room she had earned her place in. The comments spiraled quickly. Some came to her defense. Many didn't. The worst weren't even about her work, they were about her appearance, her voice, her family name. Alina sat frozen, the air thick around her. She couldn't breathe. By the time Graham entered the lab, the room had gone quiet. Every screen was lit with the same image, the same headline, the same sense of slow-moving disaster. He looked once at the wall of monitors, then turned to her. Their eyes met, but he said nothing. He simply turned to Arthur and said, "Let's shut it down for today. I'll handle PR." Alina stood. Her hands trembled. "Handle it how?" He looked at her, calm, professional, cold. "We'll issue a statement, clarifying roles and internal structure. The board will want to ensure everyone understands company hierarchy." Hierarchy. That word splintered something inside her. She stepped back, So you'll clarify that I'm what? The janitor, the mascot, the experiment gone too far. Elena, no. Say it. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. And that was the answer. She walked out, down the hallway, past the glass offices and knowing glances, into the service stairwell where no one would see the tears she refused to let fall in public. She descended floor by floor, her body moving ahead of her mind, her breath ragged. When she reached the ground level, she didn't stop. She kept walking, out the front doors, into the gray Chicago afternoon, across the street, past the food trucks she used to dream about affording, toward the L-Tran station where she had first stood when she applied for the janitorial job years earlier, carrying nothing but a resume printed at the library and her father's last words echoing in her head. Don't let the world decide your worth before you've had a chance to show it. She rode the train home in silence. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Rachel, Matteo, even Arthur. She ignored them all. When she arrived at the apartment, her mother looked up from the kitchen table, concern immediately lining her face. Alina, I need some air, she whispered. Alina, please talk to me. But she was already walking to the back porch, already letting the cold wind hit her face. Her lungs burned, her throat ached. But the worst part, the part that hollowed her, wasn't the shame. It was the betrayal. Not by the internet. That was expected. By him, Graham Whitaker, who had stood with her in quiet rooms and handed her quotes about breaking silence. Now hid behind one. She sat outside for hours, wrapped in an old quilt, listening to the world hum around her. Traffic, laughter, someone's dog barking. The rhythm of life went on, indifferent. The next morning she drafted her resignation. She didn't send it yet, but she folded it into her bag like a goodbye. She knew she would eventually say. At NeuroCore, she arrived early, before most of the office had filtered in. She cleaned out her small storage space tote bag, notebooks, the plant Rachel had gifted her on her first week as an official consultant, though it had never been called that on paper. When Graham found her, she was standing at the elevator, staring at her reflection. Alina, I'll go quietly, she said. No need for statements, just delete me. He flinched. It was subtle, but she saw it. I didn't speak yesterday because the board was watching, he began. She turned to him. And I was watching you. Silence. You had the chance to rewrite the story, she said. To say that maybe brilliance doesn't always come wrapped in a title. And you chose silence. He took a breath. I was trying to protect you from escalation. I don't need protection. I needed a partner. She stepped into the elevator and hit the ground floor button. Just before the doors closed, she added quietly, Don't protect me, Graham. Stand beside me or stand out of my way. When she was gone, Graham stood in the hallway for a long time, looking at the empty space she left behind. For the rest of the day, the office moved in hushed murmurs. No one said it aloud, but they knew. NeuroCore felt ... quieter, duller. Even the think tank seemed to dim without her presence. That evening, Rachel cornered him outside his office. You let her walk away, she said. She made her choice, he replied. No, Rachel said. You made yours first. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he reread every note she had ever written on the emotional models. Every metaphor she used to explain how machines could mimic memory not by code alone, but by connection. She hadn't just helped them advance their technology. She had reminded them why it mattered, and in the end, he had let fear of perception outweigh the truth of impact. He clicked open the PR draft, sitting on his desktop. It was a standard piece, polished, clean, safe. He deleted it. The next morning, a new post went live on the company blog. It didn't come from PR. It came from Graham's personal account. It read, There is brilliance that can be taught, and brilliance that walks in the door wearing a uniform you weren't wise enough to look past. I made the mistake of staying silent when I should have spoken. NeuroCore owes much of its progress to Alina Torres, who reminded us that intelligence doesn't always wear credentials. Sometimes it just needs a chance to speak. And next time, I intend to listen. No corporate signatures, no board approval, just the truth. He hit publish. Then he sat back, wondering if it was too late to rebuild a bridge he had burned with silence. Far across the city, Elena sat with her brother, Matteo, watching cartoons and trying not to refresh her phone. When the notification came through, she stared at it for a long moment. Then she read the post. Once, twice, 3 times. She didn't cry. Not yet. but she did breathe, deeper than she had in days. Still, she didn't reply. Not out of anger, out of something else. Something like self-respect. Some silences weren't walls, they were mirrors. And for now, she needed to see who she was away from anyone else's shadow. The days following Graham's public statement passed in a strange kind of limbo. Alina read the post more times than she could admit, each reading peeling back another layer of meaning. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was more honest than any polished PR response could have ever been. And honesty, she'd learned, was rarer than genius. Still, she didn't return. She needed time not to be convinced, not to be asked back, but to choose what kind of life she wanted, what kind of voice she wanted to have in it. She spent more mornings with her mother, who had started asking gentle questions again, the way only a mother could when trying not to prod open a wound. She volunteered at the community tech hub she used to clean years ago, this time not with a mop but with a whiteboard and a marker, showing kids how to think and code, how to see emotion as a variable that could be mapped, understood, even translated into logic. The kids called her Ms. Alina, and she didn't correct them when they assumed she was a professor. In those fluorescent-lit rooms full of too many chairs and not enough computers, she felt herself return to something pure-curiosity. Meanwhile, Graham was unraveling. He'd built a neurocore with vision, precision, and cold certainty. But after Alina left, the silence she left behind echoed in every part of the company. Rachel became more withdrawn. Arthur started taking more meetings remotely. The think tank gathered dust, as if no one dared draw on its walls anymore. And Graham himself, he functioned, but only just. He met deadlines, signed contracts, approved updates, but his brilliance dulled, like a machine running on backup power. He thought of her constantly, not just her ideas, but her presence, the way she challenged without cruelty, the way she saw truth beneath polish, the way she had stared him down in that elevator and said the one thing no one else ever dared: I needed a partner. And she was right. He hadn't treated her as one, not when it mattered most. That realization led him, 3 weeks after her departure, to a place he had not visited in years, the South Side branch of the Chicago Public Library. He found her by accident, in the basement tech room, kneeling beside a boy no older than 9 who was typing furiously into a program she recognized from her old neurocore prototype. Graham stood at the doorway, unnoticed, watching. She looked radiant, not in the aesthetic way magazines defined it, but in something truer, focused, animated, completely alive in the joy of teaching. When she finally saw him, her smile faltered. She stood slowly, arms crossed. I didn't expect you here. I didn't expect to come, but here I am. The boy beside her whispered, Is that your boyfriend? She flushed. Definitely not. Graham smiled. Definitely not. Yet, she narrowed her eyes. Don't joke. I'm not, he said softly. She studied him. He looked tired, less crisp than usual, but his voice was steady. I came to listen, he added. Really listen this time. Not as your boss, not as a CEO, as someone who wants to learn from you. She didn't move, but her posture shifted, slightly. A flicker of openness. I'm not going back, she said. No, I don't want to be someone you allow to speak anymore. I want to create spaces where people like me don't need permission in the first place. He nodded. Then let's build that. She blinked. What? I have a proposal, not for neurocore, for you, for something else entirely. He stepped forward, his voice gaining weight. I've been thinking. Neurocore works because of minds like yours. But most people like you don't make it past the lobby. I want to start a project, a separate lab, a non-profit, funded independently. You design it, you name it, you lead it. I'll just be the support. This time, she stared at him. Why would you do that? Because you were never just a disruption to my company. You were the answer to everything it had forgotten to ask. The room went still. You're serious? She asked. I am. And if you say no, I'll respect it. But if you say yes, he exhaled, we'll build something that makes it impossible for another Alina Torres to go unnoticed ever again. She didn't reply. Not immediately. She turned back to the boy at the keyboard. Can I think about it? She finally asked. Of course, and so she did. For the next week, she asked questions, hard ones. She drafted proposals, rejected most of them, and wrote new ones. She imagined a center that taught AI not just as science but as language, human, emotional, inclusive. A space where young minds didn't have to look or speak a certain way to be taken seriously. She asked Graham to meet her for coffee one afternoon, not at a boardroom, but at the corner cafe across from her old bus stop. She wore a grey hoodie and no makeup. He wore the same suit he'd probably slept in. "I have conditions," she said. He nodded. "Name them." 1. I choose my own team. No board oversight. Done. 2. It runs parallel to neurocoronaut beneath it. Agreed. 3. I want to name it, of course. What's the name? She smiled slightly. The Mind and Heart Project. Graham's jaw softened. Perfect. A pause. Then, more quietly, and for if this is going to work, you have to stop treating your own silence like safety. You're allowed to speak from the heart. 2. Graham. He looked at her then, not as a leader or a subordinate, not as a puzzle to decode or a problem to solve. Just Alina, the woman who had challenged everything he thought he knew about value. "I want to learn how," he said. That was all, and that was enough. 3 months later, the Mind and Heart Project launched its pilot cohort. 10 students, ages 12 to 20, from underserved schools across Chicago. Alina led the team. Graham funded the lab, but kept his distance, unless asked. Rachel joined as co-director. Arthur ran back-end systems. They partnered with local libraries, hired more instructors, built a curriculum rooted in emotional intelligence, and neurologic. And Alina found her voice again, not just in front of whiteboards, or with the students who looked at her like she was magic, but in the quiet moments, to writing curriculum late at night, designing exercises that would have once terrified her, stepping into her leadership not as an exception but as the new standard. The first time she gave a public keynote, she stood on stage in front of hundreds of people, some of whom had mocked her months ago. She wore her janitor's badge around her neck proudly, and she began, not with science, but with a story. "I used to clean floors in a building where the doors to the future were glass and locked. Today, we're building new doors and handing out keys." When she stepped down, Graham was waiting at the edge of the stage. "You didn't just speak," he said. "You moved people." She smiled. "You taught me how to find structure." "I just added meaning." He didn't respond with words, just took her hand, briefly, without expectation. And this time, she didn't let go. The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, slipped beneath Elena's apartment door like a whisper from another life. She didn't notice it at first, too wrapped in finishing a presentation for the next round of applicants to the Mind and Heart Project. But when she opened the door for the delivery guy from the corner cafe, the envelope caught her eye. Thick, white, unmarked, except for her name, written in delicate serif, font. Alina Torres. She froze. That was never how bills arrived, or junk mail, or job rejections. This was the kind of envelope that carried decisions. She sat down on the worn couch, the weight of the past and the future tilting the room ever so slightly. Inside, one crisp letterhead. "Dear Ms. Torres, we are delighted to inform you that you have been awarded a full academic scholarship to Stanford University's Advanced Cognitive Computing and Emotional AI program." The words swam. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a misprint. Her hands shook as she reread it. The offer was real. The world had noticed. The university she once only saw in donated textbooks had not just seen her, they wanted her. Across the room, her mother looked up from the kitchen. "You okay, Mia?" Elena held up the letter wordlessly. Her mother walked over, read it, then looked at her daughter with something between awe and ache. She whispered. They sat together, letting the meaning settle in. Stanford. California. Away. Later that night, Elena walked alone along the Lake Michigan shoreline, the wind biting, her boots crunching against gravel. She thought of the years she'd spent hidden in plain sight, cleaning offices, solving equations in notebooks no one ever read. And then this, a door wide open, a seat at a table she never thought she'd be invited to. But was she ready to leave what she had built? The Mind and Heart Project was just beginning to take root. Students she mentored daily were starting to believe in their own voices. Graham, still distant in ways she didn't fully understand, had begun to soften, not just toward her, but toward the world. He listened now. He paused. He asked questions instead of delivering answers. And yet, the call of Stanford was something deeper than ambition. It was unfinished business. It was the little girl who used to build circuits out of broken toys, waiting to be seen by the world she once felt invisible to. She returned home past midnight and didn't sleep. The next day, she met Graham at the Mind and Heart Lab, where the sunlight filtered through the newly installed skylights they'd designed together. He was reviewing curriculum updates. When he saw her, he smiled until he saw the letter in her hand. She passed it to him without a word. He read it once. Slowly, when he looked up, there was no anger, no resistance. Just the hint of something she hadn't seen before, in his eyes, pride, shadowed by grief. "You deserve this," he said, quietly. "I don't want to leave what we've built, but you have to go." Alina sat beside him, her heart in her throat. "What if it all falls apart without me?" Graham shook his head. "It won't, because you didn't build something that depends on you. You built something that will outlast you. That's leadership, Alina." She looked at him. "Come with me." He blinked. "To Stanford?" "No," she said. "Just walk with me a while." They left the lab and strolled through the quiet streets of downtown Chicago, past murals they used to admire on rushed commutes, past bridges under which her brother once skateboarded, while she waited with fear and pride. "You were the first person to see me fully," she said at last. "I think you were the first to see me, too," Graham replied. "Not the resume, not the company, just ... me." They stopped at the corner where the Mind and Heart project began, an old bench beside a vacant lot that would soon become the second teaching lab. "I'm scared," Alina admitted. "Of what?" "Of forgetting who I was before they gave me a name tag with genius on it." Graham's voice was barely audible. "You're the only one who never needed a name tag to be seen." They sat in silence. A week later, she packed her bags. The farewell gathering was small. Just students, her team, and her family. Graham didn't give a speech. He simply handed her a sealed envelope and said, "For the first night you doubt yourself." She boarded the plane with the envelope tucked into her notebook. Stanford was sunlight, palms swaying, lab doors that opened with her fingerprint, classrooms filled with accents and brilliance, and the kind of confidence that only came from people who had never been dismissed. And yet, she held her own. She introduced new frameworks that merged emotional AI with cultural narrative recognition. Her research earned faculty attention within months. She was no longer a hidden spark. She was fire in motion. But there were nights when the air felt too clean, when the voices were too polished, when she missed the sound of Chicago, thunder against her apartment windows, or the scratch of chalk on the think tank walls. And she missed him, more than she admitted. Late one evening, after a particularly exhausting roundtable debate on ethical biases in synthetic empathy, Alina sat in the campus garden and finally opened Graham's envelope. Inside was a single note. "You were never brilliant because they said so. You were brilliant because you kept showing up even when they did." And beneath it, a question scribbled like an afterthought. "When you're done conquering the West Coast, will you come home?" Her eyes stung, but she smiled. She wasn't ready yet, but one day she would be. The plane touched down in Chicago just past midnight, the runway slick with November rain. Alina sat still as the other passengers gathered their belongings, her hands resting quietly in her lap. It had been 10 months since she left. 10 months of discovering the edges of her brilliance and learning, with both awe and discomfort, that she didn't have to fight so hard to be heard anymore. But what she missed most wasn't validation. It was silence, the kind she had only known in one place. The think tank wall on a Sunday morning, with a marker in her hand and Graham leaning in just far enough to breathe beside her but not interrupt. That was the kind of silence she had learned to treasure. Chicago greeted her with a familiar bite in the wind. Her mother met her at the airport, arms flung wide. There were no big speeches, just a long hug and a soft welcome home against her hair. And that was enough. She didn't tell anyone else she had returned. Not yet. The city had changed. In her absence, or perhaps she had. The murals felt more vivid, the skyline taller, but warmer. She walked past the empty lot where the second Mind and Heart Lab had finally broken ground. Its outline was steel and promise. Her name, someone had told her, was on the foundation plaque. She hadn't seen it herself yet. She wasn't sure she needed to. It was late the following afternoon when she finally walked through the doors of the original Mind and Heart project. No one had expected her. Students were in session. Arthur was adjusting a projector. Rachel was reviewing applications. And Graham, he wasn't there. "Where is he?" Alina asked. Rachel blinked. "He doesn't come in as much these days. Said the place runs better when he's not trying to control it." That surprised her more than it should have. She left her bag in her old office and touched exactly how she had left it, and took the elevator up to the roof, where she used to sketch ideas when the walls below felt too tight. He was there, not standing in his usual suit-clad rigidity, but sitting cross-legged on a bench, hair windswept, eyes closed, listening to music on an old pair of headphones. She approached quietly, still escaping to the clouds. She asked. Graham turned. The moment he saw her, something unguarded flickered in his face. He removed the headphones slowly, as if trying to keep reality from rushing in too fast. "Alina," he said, "and nothing else. You're not going to ask what I'm doing here?" "No, because I already know." She sat beside him. The space between them felt familiar, like the pause in a song you've memorized, waiting to resume. "I finished my thesis," she said. "I read it," he replied. That caught her off guard. "You did?" "Twice," she smiled. "Any notes?" It was flawless and infuriating, because it made me realize I'd been building machines when I should have been designing doors. She turned toward him fully. "I want to be part of this again. Not to lead, necessarily. Not to fix what's broken. Just ... to grow it." Graham nodded. "You never really left, Alina. The lab still runs on your heartbeat." They sat in silence for a long moment, the Chicago skyline glowing around them like a crown of light. "I missed this," she whispered. "I missed you," he answered. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, Alina reintegrated slowly. She took no title, attended meetings without leading them, mentored the new team with gentleness and fire. She brought her Stanford research not as proof of status, but as offering. Her presence rebalanced the ecosystem. She reminded everyone, especially Graham, that intelligence was not a fortress to guard, but a bridge to build. The students changed. The younger ones had grown bold in her absence. Some already had startup prototypes. One girl had even written a neural poem using the code Alina had once designed on a napkin. It was working. The vision was working. But something else had changed. Graham he didn't speak as often in meetings, but when he did, people listened differently. He delegated with trust. He thanked his team without fanfare. He had built an extension of himself he no longer needed to control. One evening, after a late brainstorming session, they found themselves alone in the main lab. The lights were dim, the board full of unfinished thoughts. "You really stepped back," Alina said. "You made it possible." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you remember?" he asked. "That day we argued in the elevator." She laughed. "Which one?" "The first one, I remember. I wasn't just afraid of you being right," he said. "I was afraid that if I ever truly let someone in, I'd lose control of what I built. But when you left, I realized it wasn't control I needed. It was connection." Her voice caught. "Graham, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Not yet. I just want to say thank you for teaching me how to build more than a company, for teaching me how to be a man worth working with." She reached out, her hand covering his. "No one ever taught me how to accept being seen," she said, "until you did." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. It dusted the windows, softened the edges of the city. And inside, something even quieter, even stronger, began to grow. Neither of them said it, but both knew. This wasn't just a return, it was a re-beginning. Alina stood before the mirror, in the small restroom of the community auditorium, adjusting the tiny lapel mic clipped to her collar. Her fingers trembled, though not from fear. It was something quieter, something almost sacred. In 5 minutes, she would take the stage to deliver the keynote address for the Mind and Heart Project's inaugural national summit. 3 years had passed since the day she returned to Chicago. In that time, the program had grown beyond what anyone had imagined. There were now 4 learning centers: Chicago, Oakland, Detroit, and Atlanta, with hundreds of students enrolled. The curriculum had become a model for integrating emotional intelligence into AI learning systems. Her Stanford research was now taught in classrooms bearing her name, and yet, nothing humbled her more than the sight of the auditorium tonight packed, not with investors or scholars, but with teachers, single parents, janitors, immigrants, dropouts, coders, and artists. People like the one she used to be. People like the girl who once solved complex equations on cleaning carts while pretending not to exist. Graham stood beside the stage, wearing a grey suit and a smile that was still a little awkward, still a little too small for the man he had become. But there was warmth in his eyes, a kind of home. "You ready?" he asked. "No," she said, smiling. But I'm going anyway. The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. Her name was announced with reverence. She stepped out into the spotlight. For a heartbeat. She stood silently, letting her eyes adjusted not to the brightness, but to the weight of the moment. Her palms were open at her sides. She didn't carry notes. She didn't need them. I never wanted to be seen, she began. I wanted to be understood. The audience leaned in when I started my journey. I didn't have the right credentials. I didn't have a polished voice. What I had was a mind full of questions and a heart that wouldn't stay quiet. And for a long time, that wasn't enough. Until someone asked me to speak anyway. Her gaze found Graham's in the front row. Who built mind and heart not to elevate the most brilliant minds, but to remind the world that brilliance doesn't always look like what we've been taught to see. It speaks in accents. It codes in silence. It grows in places people forget to look. She paused. Tonight, I don't want to talk about success. I want to talk about legacy, because success fades. Legacies echo. And if you're in this room, it's because you believe in building an echo that doesn't fade when the lights go down. Applause erupted. She let it pass. Then, her voice dropped softer. I used to think power came from being the loudest voice in the room, but now I know it comes from knowing when to speak and when to build a space where others can. When she stepped off stage, the standing ovation still filled the room. But what struck her most was not the applause, it was the dozen students waiting backstage. Eyes lit up. Notebooks in hand, not asking for selfies but for questions to be answered. She spent the rest of the night doing just that. Later, as the crowd thinned and the team packed up, Graham found her leaning against the side exit, looking up at the stars that peeked between buildings. "You did something tonight," he said. "No," she replied. "We did." He was quiet a moment. "I have something for you." She turned toward him, surprised. He pulled a small velvet box from his coat pocket. But when she opened it, there was no ring. Inside was a simple silver key. She looked up, puzzled. "It's to the new building, the one we just opened on the south side." She blinked. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the reason it exists." She closed the box, but not the conversation. "And what about us?" she asked. Graham didn't flinch. "I've spent a long time thinking about how to answer that." He stepped closer. "I never wanted to hold you back. I only ever wanted to walk beside you, not to lead, not to follow, just ... beside." Her eyes glistened. "And I think," he added, voice low, "that I'm finally the man who knows how to do that." They stood there, the city humming around them, and for once, there were no dramatic declarations, no desperate pleas, just people choosing, simply and without conditions, to keep building something together. Weeks passed, then months. Their relationship unfolded slowly, like a map drawn in soft pencil. They didn't rush toward labels or expectations. Instead, they moved in rhythm: coffee on Wednesdays, late-night lab sessions, handwritten notes tucked into files, spontaneous walks after meetings that turned into hours of dreaming. Their love wasn't loud. It was deliberate, layered, steady. And one spring morning, standing before a group of new mind and heart instructors, Graham finally took her hand during a break and said, "I think I'm ready." She smiled, knowing exactly what he meant. They married quietly, in the courtyard of the original lab, surrounded by students and mentors, by people who had once felt invisible and now stood tall. There was no grandeur, no press, just joy. Alina didn't wear white. She wore charcoal grey because she wanted to be grounded, not glorified. Graham wore a suit with no tie, because for once, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. Their vows were short. "We promised to keep building." That was all. Years later, a little girl with thick curls and a stubborn streak would run through the think tank halls, chalk in hand, asking her parents why machines couldn't feel the way people did. And Alina would kneel beside her and say, "Because they haven't learned from you yet." And Graham would smile from the corner, knowing that the spark they once lit in silence had turned into something no one could ever extinguish. Not a company, not a legacy, but a truth, that brilliance lives in unlikely places, and that love, the kind that listens before it speaks, always finds its way home. Alina Torres began her story not in boardrooms or lecture halls, but in the quiet, overlooked corners of a tech empire, working as a janitor at Carter Innovations. With a mind built for innovation and a heart shaped by resilience, she solved a complex equation that even the brightest minds had failed to crack. This moment caught the attention of Graham Carter, the cold, calculating CEO who had built his company on efficiency, not empathy. That their paths collided in ways neither expected. Graham, driven by logic and control, saw something in Elena he couldn't define, something beyond brilliance. And Elena, though hesitant, stepped into a world that had never welcomed someone like her. Through mentorship, long nights in the think tank, and moments of raw honesty, their dynamic evolved from friction to mutual respect. But their journey wasn't linear. When Elena was offered a full scholarship to Stanford's elite AI program, she chose growth over comfort. She left, not to escape, but to expand. And though Graham let her go, he began the harder work of changing not only his leadership but himself. Elena returned with more than knowledge. She came back with purpose. Together, they reimagined what innovation could mean when rooted in humanity. They grew the Mind and Heart Project into a national model, one that uplifted unseen talent, honored emotion, and broke barriers for those who had been ignored. What began as a chance encounter between a janitor and a CEO became a movement, a romance, a redefinition of what it means to be powerful. Years later, they stood side by side, not as boss and employee, not as genius and investor, but as partners in vision, in impact, and in life. Their love was never loud, but it changed everything. Life lesson. The story of Elena and Graham teaches us that brilliance isn't always born in the spotlight. Sometimes, the most extraordinary potential is hidden in silence, waiting for someone to listen and love. Real love grows when two people choose not to fix each other, but to build something greater together in your own life. Never underestimate your worth because of where you start, and never forget that the quiet spark inside, it might be the beginning of someone else's transformation. Quick question for you. What do you think truly changed Graham's heart? A. Seeing Elena's intelligence and potential. B. Experiencing emotional connection and shared vulnerability. Comment A or B below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What about you? Do you believe emotional intelligence is as valuable as raw skill in today's world? Or have you ever felt like Elena, overlooked but full of potential? Share your story in the comments so others can be inspired. And if this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button and support our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating stories that touch the heart and celebrate voices that deserve to be heard. Thank you for being part of this journey. We're just getting started.